I have the great pleasure to introduce my old friend, Greg Gibson. Greg is one of the first people I met in Gloucester when I got here in the mid-70s. His young family and I were neighbors on Bass Ave. I learned from Greg that he received a BA at Swarthmore College, and while the war in Vietnam raged, he dodged the draft by enlisting in the Navy, where he worked as a ship fitter on a submarine tender. Greg likes to recall that that the Navy years was an ideal grad school experience. After the service, he came to Gloucester to go fishing. The fishing wasn't all that great, but he did make a great catch when he found his bride, Anne Marie Crotty. In the late 70s, Greg and I and a handful of other artists in town worked in Jimmy Carter's CETA program. The Gloucester Arts and Humanities gave artists a paycheck to live on and to produce public art for the city of Gloucester. During that time, he got into the antiquarian book business and allowed him a lot of time to read and write. He says that when Galen was killed, my earlier interest in writing resurfaced. Writing a book was my focus in this difficult time, my revenge initially and ultimately my salvation. The book was called Don Boy, A Walkabout, a Father's Search for the Truth of His Son's Murder. It was followed by Demon of the Waters, Herbert's Freaks, The Old Turk's Load, and his latest book that is available at the back of the room, Mooney's Manifesto. I want to welcome my buddy Greg, who will speak briefly about his life and writing, and then introduce our second poet and writer, Matt Donovan. Gregor.
Thanks, Henry. I first met Henry never mind. Thank you, Gloucester Writers Center, for getting it all together. Rocky Neck Cultural Center for providing a venue, and thank you all for turning out for this reading, about which I have a few observations. In the old days, when you published a book, they'd send you on reading tours. My first book in 1999, they sent me down the East Coast and then up and down the West Coast. And I read at bookstores, demonstrations, conferences, radio, TV. I read and read and read. And my second book, 2003, they sent me down the East Coast, but only as far as New Bedford, which was a worrying sign. And sure enough, in my third book, they didn't send me anywhere. What they sent me was a pile of paper with a note on top bearing the glad tidings that thanks to the miracle of the internet and social media that I could now be my own publicist. And they were sure that I would do a grand job of making myself famous, and to back up this questionable assertion, they were sending this manual on how to enhance my profile on this marvelous new social media app called MySpace. MySpace. Social media? Are there any other kind of media, plural? So much for my career with social media. So much for books 3, 4, and 5. To be honest, I find this business of doing readings confusing. I mean, I write these damn things. Isn't it your job to read them? Why am I going to sit here and... I mean, I write them, you read them, right? That's how it should go, seems to me. Otherwise, I could do this in front of a mirror while I was shaving every morning, if I shaved. actually, and I'm sure you'll be happy to learn this. Authors don't insist on you reading what they write, but it's critical that you buy what they write. One time, years ago, I saw the great drummer Art Blakey down at Sandy's Jazz Revival in Beverly. And between sets, he gets up there in his lovely, he had these farmer overalls that he wore. He was just a gorgeous man, and he grabs the mic and he says in his raspy voice, "Everybody wants to know, how are we gonna save jazz music? Because jazz music is dying." He says, "Well, I'll tell you folks, how you can save jazz music is all you gotta do is buy my records." But this is serious business. And please, don't ever tell a writer, "Hey, I just got your new book out of the library." That's really hard. Which brings us to this book. I'm supposed to be holding a copy of this book so you can see the cover, but I spaced out. Hey, my man. Which brings us to this book, number 5 on the MySpace hit list, from which I will not be reading much, and you may not be reading at all, although it is my ardent hope that you buy several copies. The story, such as it is, derives from my experiences during 3 decades as a frontline advocate against gun violence in America. 31 years of reading, writing, cajoling, lobbying, arguing tirelessly against the proliferation of military-style arms in civilian hands. And look what we've accomplished. In 1978, the year my sister Wendy died of suicide with a gun, there were an unbelievable 150 million guns privately owned by Americans. Today, that number exceeds 400 million. In 1992, the year my son Galen was killed in a school shooting, nobody but cops and crooks walked around carrying guns. Today, more than half the states in the Union allow some form of concealed carry, including Massachusetts. In 1992, 20,000 Americans died from guns, and hardly anyone had heard of school shootings. Today, active shooter drills are a part of grade school life, and we suffer more than 40,000 gun deaths a year. Now, I'm perfectly willing to admit that these shocking increases in guns and gun violence are an eloquent testimony to my failure as an advocate. But in terms of this book of mine, I'm working with a different sort of experience gleaned over the years. Because all the while I've been trying and failing to reduce gun violence, I've also been bearing witness to the monumental levels of cynicism, greed, corruption, stupidity, narcissism, and wanton cruelty that lead each year to the unimaginable suffering of tens of thousands of families, of thousands of communities. And you folks there, 400 billion a year is coming out of your wallet. And that could be going to something like, maybe getting a new cut bridge, I don't know. And this is a situation, I might remind you, over which we, as adult members of a functioning democracy, should have had some control. And I must confess to you now that as a result of all I've witnessed over the past 30 years, I can only conclude that we, the American people, and perhaps we as a species, have, not to put too fine a point on it, lost our fucking minds. Starting with our national leaders, who will tell you as if it's as obvious as gravity that our national economy must keep growing each year or we will fail as a nation. Utterly insane. And you don't need to be a shrink to figure this one out. Anybody who knows anything about compound interest can tell you what will happen if you let a measly $5 bill out at even 2% for a century. You're going to wind up north of $2 fucking billion. In other words, we're on a course to consume this planet so we can buy Ford F-150s or whatever we need to do. All you have to do is step outside to discover that we, as a species, are currently involved in cooking ourselves alive. Hottest July globally. Anybody see that? If anybody reads the papers anymore, I don't know. Hottest July ever. It brings to mind the old parable about frogs swimming around in a kettle of water on the stove, right? You all know that. Blissfully unaware that the burner beneath the kettle is turned on. Here we are with the water actually warming up. And all we can do is argue about whether it would be bad for business to turn the heat off. Frog stew. Everyone knows that our youth are quite literally our future. The fact that gun death is now the #1 killer of children in America. Cancer, see you later, man. Car accidents, forget about it. That we're murdering our kids at a rate 5 times greater than in any other highly developed, industrialized, technologically advanced, educated, and wealthy country in the world means, what does it mean? We're murdering our future. We're committing national suicide. We're crazy. And what's up with this Massachusetts legislator thing going on their summer vacations, leaving the long-awaited omnibus gun bill DOA for the session because of some bullshit political pissing contest up in the State House? Who elected these clowns anyway? Oh, wait a minute. In the words of that stalwart defender of democracy, Liz Cheney, the problem with American politics is that we're electing idiots. Please note that she didn't say you, she said we. I can't tell you how we've managed to screw things up so badly with climate change, drugs, poverty, immigration, racism, or the Boston Red Sox, though I have my suspicions. About having closely observed gun violence, I can speak for a moment about one of the ways in which we enable this shameful national disgrace. A majority of Americans persist in a mistaken belief that gun violence is something dreadful that happens everywhere and needs to stop, but that it could never happen to them. This stark contradiction between what we believe and what we see every day is a classic example of cognitive dissonance. The collision between two strongly held and mutually opposing ideas. Imagine what that does in your brain out there. And this is a situation in which the news media, liberal or conservative, mainstream or wacko, play a major part. They need content, and what could be better than the carnage caused by military-style firearms in civilian hands? Suicide, mass murder, and criminal violence lead and bleed on a daily basis. And who's addicted to the 24-hour news cycle? Who's dependent on this gruesome daily gruel? Everyone. That's who. This is how gun violence becomes normalized. This is the manner in which we ignore it. Obviously, the constant pressure of these mutually opposing ideas is terribly stressful. In fact, dealing with rampant cognitive dissonance on a daily basis is making us all even crazier than we already are. And I mean daily, like you're crazy, and then more happens, and then you compound on that craziness just like compound interest. But we don't notice this because we're busy with frog stew. So this book, this calm, lyrical, demented work of fiction, more than one person has called it an autobiography, which is really scary. This work of fiction is concerned with our national insanity as it affects an individual. It documents the descent of an ordinary guy, Joe Mooney, into the depths. As a result of gun violence, he loses his family, his marriage, his friends, and everything of importance to him, except his profession, at which he continually fails. And he fails as a do-gooder, as a service provider, as an advocate. And as the world's insanity eats away at him, he becomes increasingly isolated. Then, at the very bottom of those depths of loneliness and paranoia, he sees what he must do to restore order to a world that has fallen apart. And this involves committing a hideous crime for what he believes is the greater good. We learn from his narration that he's already committed this crime, and while he's waiting to see what happens, he is recounting for us the advent of his breakdown and its consequences. And it all sounds very reasonable. It just happens to be insane. Here's a bit of chapter 2. Joe Mooney talking now. I was sitting in my office in the Book Palace looking out the window toward our house across the street. My soon-to-be ex-wife boyfriend was parked out front. But I wasn't looking at his car or the house. I noticed that 2 mosquitoes had gotten trapped between the screen and the window, drunk on my blood, no doubt, and were bashing themselves stupidly, repeatedly against the screen. I started watching them, annoyed at their stupidity and at my own for watching them. That made me want to destroy them, and by some funny mischance, that urge made me think about the gun in the top drawer of my desk. I thought about the guys down at Smitty's gun shop and all the guns in their showcases and on their racks and shelves. I thought about where all those guns had come from. I thought about trying to get this next page turned, and where they were bound, and suddenly the sky cracked open and I saw America's gun problem for what it truly was. Hardly any animals left to kill, and after a dozen ARs, pistols, shotguns, and rifles, the average collector's acquisitional urges are bound to diminish. The real markets for guns, the last markets left, are soldiers and criminals. And soldiers are getting all the guns they need. The truth is that gun makers make guns for use by bad guys. Guns that somehow by theft or straw purchase or other illegal means fall into the wrong hands. Not our fault, industry people cry. Then they make more guns for people who imagine they need guns to defend themselves against the people who already have guns. An interesting question came to me then. How come crazed gunmen never go after the people who make the guns? They shoot politicians, and they shoot their wives, and they shoot one another. They even shoot themselves, for crying out loud. And cops, there'd been that renewed rash of police assassinations, as I'm sure you recall. In that context, shooting the cynical motherfuckers behind the gun industry didn't seem like much of a leap. Then later, I've spent years closely watching nothing happen, or watching a lot happen, most of which involves people getting killed by guns and politicians doing nothing about it. Politics, friends, has degenerated into mere performance, while governance takes place in venues unseen by us, beyond our control. Corporations conspire with murky global interests, and the gun, that terrible, brutal, crucial gun, operates on their behalf as the delivery system for the consequences of racism, poverty, injustice, and the madness they inspire. And we drift witless in the mighty system. Here's a typical gun murder report, of which there are several equally horrible in this book, which I'd like to share with you now. If I may take a little sidetrack here on the whole idea of sharing, because I am going to share this with you. But if you have a plate and somebody puts a pile of steaming shit on it, are they sharing with you? Just asking. The perpetrator of the chicken plant shooting had used a paperclip to make his AR fire on full auto, but he'd been intent on vengeance rather than mass murder. He was after the line boss and the shift manager, with whom he'd had prior issues that had resulted in his being fired. He found the manager first and shot him at close range with the AR, expending most of a 30-round magazine in an eye blink and distributing the poor manager's body parts among the chicken parts. Eyewitnesses said it was a horrendous scene. He also wounded two nearby line workers. It is difficult for someone without training to control the fire of a fully automatic rifle, so there were unintended casualties. Then, of course, the jury-rigged paperclip device failed. He went after the line boss with a revolver and put 3 slugs in him before blowing his own brains out. Because there were only 2 fatalities, 3 depending on how you counted, it didn't really qualify as a mass shooting, but as you probably recall, it got plenty of news coverage because the shooter was an illegal alien. Heads rolled at the chicken plant when that information came out. But it was too late for the line boss, and it was too late for the dismembered manager who'd hired him illegally in the first place. The same question was on everyone's mind. How did he get the guns if he was an illegal alien? But it was only a rhetorical question because everyone knew, you probably know already, that he got his guns from some guy in a parking lot, or maybe from a bad apple at a gun show. Gun control people were outraged. Another loophole. Republicans and the NRA accused them of taking advantage of a tragic killing for propaganda purposes. Both were right, but the gun control people were righter. as this narrator, Joe, scans the papers every day for news of his crime, he discovers, according to a disappointingly brief article buried in the middle of this morning's New York Times, quote, officials remain mum on holiday shootings. Whoever says mum in real life? 3 weeks and I'm off the front page? They seem to have figured out that the murders are related in some way, but God, it's torturous. I feel sorry for the newspapers, trying so hard, always falling behind Twitter, slowly starving, getting skinnier and skinnier. That's why I try to support them. Wall Street Journal and Rockledge Courier delivered each morning, New York Times and USA Today on my daily walk down to 7-Eleven. Of course, I'm dying to know if they're really on to me, those mum ones, and if the, quote, monstrous act I performed against Becker and those others have yet had their effect on the American psyche. Could that be why they're keeping a lid on this thing? Once people understand why it happened, it will happen again. It will, and again. Meanwhile, a bizarre op-ed in USA Today has given me a great idea for a science fiction story. The piece was called, "Why Waste More Money on Science?" And the gist was that our experiments with artificial intelligence would soon escape us. Robots would no longer be under our control. All our efforts to halt global warming, to end terrorism, to rid the planet of nuclear weapons, all our well-meaning attempts to make the world a better place were futile because artificial intelligence would soon be in control of us. What we needed to do, the writer said, was stop all this research and take a long look at where we were headed. But I thought, great, let the robots take over. They'll be more rational than humans, incapable of greed, lust, and selfishness. No more fanaticism. The robots take control of the world, and they'll end global warming and nuclear weapons. They'll save the planet for us. They'll save the planet from us. I think I'll stop here. Thanks for listening. Almost got carried away by those claps. Thank you so much. Before I leave, I want to tell you a story. People send me books all the time, and they're all these like books about people who get killed. Shit, I can't, the first 30 or 40 I tried to read, and after a while it says, I can't do this anymore. But a dear friend, family friend, sends us a book. And I put it in the pile, and then I get guilted out because it's a family friend, and I say, okay, not only was it a book, it was a book of poems. I said, oh, okay, I'll read one. And then I read one, and not so bad. And then I read another one, and oh, it's pretty good. And then I read another one, and I realize this guy who was writing these, he's a real poet. Man, great. But then I read in the Boston Globe some months after this that I recognize the name, this real poet whose book I have received and I can now identify, is reading at the Grolier in Cambridge this week. So Anne-Marie and I go down and we have a great dinner at some fish place, and then we go over to Grolier. I don't know if we could do a show of hands. Anybody ever been to the Grolier Poetry Shop in Cambridge? It's about the size of this stage here, right? And we come in after our fish dinner, and we're all loosey-goosey, and everybody's in there, and there's like as many of you people in this space here, and they're all wearing masks, and we don't have any masks. But as Matt pointed out, I guess that means we were safe, because whatever. And Matt reads. And then we speak after that, and I realized, man, I got something in common with this guy. So I would like to introduce to you my new good friend, Matt. Take her away.
Greg, thank you so much. I am so happy to be here in Gloucester. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank Henry for helping to put this together. Also, it's been great to see old friends from Santa Fe. It's been over 20 years, so that has been a thrill. And I want to say too, it is such an incredible honor to read with Greg. I started writing this book because, like so many of us, I just felt such, grief about the ongoing gun violence, but also rage at the impotence for anything to change. And then I also felt like I didn't know anything about guns or gun culture, so that became part of the motivation for writing this. That I was living in New Mexico at the time, and I hit the road, and so I spent time traveling around the country. I wanted to talk to gun owners. I wanted to ask questions, and that was, I have to say, an easy way to get gun owners to talk, was just say, I don't know anything about guns. And that people talked. People really wanted to talk. But I wanted to talk to people who had been affected by gun violence. So, I went to cities like Las Vegas and Chicago, but in other communities like Sandy Hook. And I ended up in some pretty bizarre situations too, like a D-Day reenactment with paintball down in Pennsylvania. I did an undercover poetry mission. I hope that's the only time I ever do that, at Fort Hood, participating in a military simulation down in Fort Hood. That was my wife's least favorite of my gun adventures. But I was learning so much along the way, and then the book came out, and that night at the Grolier when I met Greg, it was such a reminder to me of how much I still can learn about not just gun culture, but also the human cost of gun violence, and how many more questions I still need to ask, and how much more I still need to learn. And I've just been so incredibly grateful to get to know not only Greg, but Greg's work, which, I have to say, I find the end of Gone Boy, truly one of the most profound and moving things I've ever read. And I don't know, I feel like that's what this has been about for me, like to continue to meet people and make connections, and continue the conversation. I have a slightly different version of his story at meeting me in the Grolier, and it goes more like this, that I'm there, I'm talking to a former student who's there, masked, and I see this guy sort of hovering on the edges, and it's clear he wants to talk to me, and I try and make space, but it's clear he really wants to talk to me. And so he comes up, he holds out his hand, he introduces himself, and within the first minute, he says, the conversation went more like this: Matt, someone sent me your book. I didn't want to read your goddamn book, but finally, all right, I thought, all right, I should read this book. And I read the first poem. I hated that first poem. You never should have opened your book with that poem. But then I read the second poem, and I thought, I don't hate that one as much. And I have to say, I took all of this as the highest praise. I immediately liked him and went out and bought Gone Boy the next day. So again, it is such a pleasure to be here, and it is an honor to read with you, Greg. So I will read a couple of pieces from this book. What's that? I'm not gonna read the first one. And if anyone does buy it, just tear that out. Just move on. Yeah. I'll start with the second one. One of the places I decided it was important to go was NRA headquarters when I was traveling around. It just is a place that has loomed so large in my imagination, and I just decided I wanted to set eyes on it. And one of the things I learned, which I didn't know until I got there, was part of NRA headquarters also houses the National Firearms Museum. So that's where I spent my time because, of course, everything else is locked up and no one can get in. But the National Firearms Museum is very much free. So this poem focuses on that. There's just so many ways in which the weapons there were fetishized, in which and American history was seen through that lens. I think the only other thing you need to know is the title of it refers to a lot of the guns were sort of set forward as art objects, and that included a number of them that have been engraved almost like pointillism style, with these elaborate scenes. So that is described here. Thousands or millions of tiny dots of varying size. Once I drove through Virginia slush, the NRA headquarters, the winter air humming with the emptiness of my plan, which was not much more than the hope of doing something beyond thoughts and prayers or any one word I might try to use after seeing a self-defense catalog with its photo of a young girl sitting cross-legged against the cinder block grid of a school wall as she grips a bulletproof backpack, raising it up so that it conceals her body more or less behind a kid-friendly style, which means blue with a cascade of emojis. For the last mile, I stared at strip mall signs. Jenny Craig, elegant dancing, lead by example taekwondo, that made me feel as if I was lost in someone's idea of what America should be. Eye-catching, with plenty of parking, and a flailing inflatable tube man who rises and falls, arms raised, frantic to explain that a memory foam mattress sells for less, guaranteed. Without an appointment or idea of what to do next, I sidestepped the lobby's Tom Selleck cutout telling me something about freedom I forgot to write down, and strolled into the first room of the National Firearms Museum carrying some vague hope of what? Whatever I'd come here to find, it wasn't Annie Oakley's pistol or a custom 12-gauge commemorating Princess Di's wedding, or the gold inlaid half-dozen geese soaring between trigger and bolt of a shotgun belonging to Hermann Göring. A few lines of wall text described Bellino style, which meant, I learned, the process of utilizing thousands or millions of tiny dots of varying size to create subtly shaded scenes, which ranged from two coon hounds charging quail sheltered in long tangles of grass to a rifle's photorealistic Rolls-Royce careening toward a woman, topless, lips parted, nestled against a tiger. And peering into one mounted magnifying glass, I saw a gun engraved with a tribute to Picasso, featuring, I swear, a miniature Guernica that mimicked each detail of his horse and bull, the one jagged light in those bodies we've seen so many times. Necks craned back, each mouth in a wail, rendered in a way that reduced any trace of sorrow to mere line and shape. America, I'm done with prayers and mirrored vitrines, the yellow dots of emojis wide-eyed on a kid's armored backpack, and black dots too numerous to count, spread across those maps that track gun violence. And for what? Then again, here I am speaking to you within the silence of a poem, which is not much more than a form of prayer we've heard too many times that makes nothing change. By the time I'd finished wandering through the other rooms, it was too late to do anything but drive the same roads back to the hotel while half listening to classic rock and chasing after an idea about how we should step back and see the shape made by those black dots scattered across the US map. Although haven't we done that already? Stepped back and looked and long known what we've made? Oh, thank you. I had the really good fortune to meet Gabby Giffords in May for a really brief encounter. But during the course of that, she told a story where her organization learned that there was an Adopt a Highway program just right along the way to NRA headquarters. So they spent 3 years cleaning up trash there just so they could erect a sign that said Gabby Giffords cleaning up trash from the NRA for, since so-and-so. And she just seemed so delighted about that. I really loved it. It was like a teenage prankster or something. So one of the places I went was Dakota, Wyoming, that has, I think, the highest gun ownership rate per capita in the country. And at the time when I went there, this book started as a nonfiction book. I don't talk about this too much, but I thought it was going to be a nonfiction book. I wanted to write really directly. I wanted to ask direct questions. And I got an agent for the project, and I was writing it all as prose. And then I learned gun books do not sell. And so whereas the agent thought we'd be able to sell it no problem, everyone turned around and subsequently learned either you hate guns and so don't want to read a 400-page book about guns, or you know a lot about guns and don't need some gun noob nagging to you about guns. And so the whole project was dead in the water, but I had already spent, a lot of time traveling around, and there were certain stories and encounters and moments and then images that I couldn't relinquish, and I kept coming back to. So gradually it became this book. But when I went to Cody, at the time, I traveled these places, and I would only be able to travel so much because of time and money away from money and time away from my family. And I got to Cody, and my focus there was on arming teachers in the public schools. So at the time, this was 2017. It was a kind of novel idea. Subsequently, it has become, unfortunately, a much more common idea. But as far as I know, it's the first legislation of its kind that was being put forward. So I wanted to talk to people. So I went there for that purpose, and then I was having a conversation with a gun shop owner who was on the school board and really pushing for this idea. And he started telling me a different kind of story, and that is where this piece sort of, it's what it focuses on and relays. So this is called Solipsism, a story. Victim mentality, he told me, means sitting with your back to the door anywhere at all. Even, I was learning, while sipping a Red Bull and surrounded by tourists at the Hotel Buffalo Bill named after his daughter. I'd more likely leave my house without my pants than without my gun. So even though we were talking in the Irma's side saloon about plans to arm Cody's teachers, scenario training, lockable holsters, the deterrence of not knowing who's armed, the theme was readiness is all. Pistol in hand when opening his front door, peering through his gun shop's window before stepping inside, and how whenever he drives to another town, he'll have an AR-15 and extra mags and a quick zip-off on the back seat, a 45 on the hip, an ankle gun strapped tight while his girlfriend rides shotgun with a 38 in her purse and a .40 caliber in the back without fail. 5 guns for a drive to Billings, just in case, you never know. What else could I think but you have to be shitting me, and I can't wait to tell this tale. Before leaving town, I circled back to his store, wanting to hard grip his hand, see what else he might let slip. As I strolled the rifles and pistols, clips and cases, gun safes and gunpowder, waiting for him to finish whatever he was doing with the gun he held, the green eyes of a taxidermy leopard stared at something that was not me, its dark mouth hinged open enough to show the curved shape someone had chosen for its tongue. Hey, I'm glad you came back. Don't take this the wrong way, but I've been telling folks, I met some guy who doesn't own a gun, an unarmed dad, and no one can believe it. We looked at each other for a half beat, maybe more, and didn't say what we were thinking about how each of us had chosen to move through this world, or how both of us by then had turned into a story about something impossible, glimpsed somewhere we thought we knew. I haven't spoken to him since. Thank you. One of the really interesting things about that visit, and that's where the real dug-up gun museum is, which became the title piece of this collection, which is the kind of place I wasn't able to find room for in the nonfiction books. So in the end, I don't think I was even equipped to write that nonfiction book, and then the form of poems and its associative and imagistic work is something that I think maybe served it better in the topics anyway. So I feel lucky that my nonfiction project failed. But when I was out there talking to people, the sheriff was definitely against this idea of arming teachers. The Republican mayor out there, the first thing he said to me was, I think we need to do some real interrogation of this culture of fear that's consuming our country. We're a long way from that now. I grew up in Northeast Ohio, and for me, one of the revelations of this book was to go back to Cleveland, where I spent a day with a ballistics detective there, and just had that feeling after hearing. I mean, part of the question there was just how does a gun work, and he was talking to me about that. But in the course of that day, just to hear the stories of the ongoing gun violence in a city like Cleveland, which is a place that I love and that I think about fondly, but I realized just the extent to which I didn't even know it. So a lot of this poem focuses on that day and images that I encountered and things he told me. Poem not ending with blossoms. Think of an oar, the cop said, and I pictured one, raised and dripping above the waves. How it'll slice through water, or if you turn it, it'll slam against the surface instead. The metaphor intended to explain the difference between hollow point and round nose bullets. Although the more I imagine the gripped oar, its dip or clumsy splash, the further I seem to drift from the work of any gun, yet without ever gliding from here, this once bustling, fluorescent lit 7th floor space that used to be police headquarters, but had been gutted after a recent move which left behind only a few detectives to wade through decades of rape kits and FedEx boxes of narcotics and a storehouse maze that ended in what had once been a communal shower, now crowded with trash bags stuffed with heroin and guarded by a display of horror hostess Elvira adorned with a respirator mask. He offered another comparison. It's a choice between an ice pick or hammer passing through your chest, cued perhaps by the property room we toured upstairs, a place where everything linked to a violent crime was grouped by semblance in untidy heaps. Toasters crowding shelves next to microwaves, laptops stacked near rows of flat-screen TVs, and sledgehammers tossed on a cord-tangled mess of nail guns and drills. There were guns, of course, more than 40,000 piled into filing cabinets, shopping carts, or rain barrels, depending on their size. Over here, he pointed to a mannequin head perched on 6 prosthetic limbs. We're trying to make a full body, but only have one head and these legs. Why, I asked, since it seemed worth asking, are there so many baby swings in here? Sometimes you don't want to know. But because I'd wanted to know how a bullet works, for reasons I can no longer explain, he led me downstairs to Bertha, a test-fire tank made from plexiglass pool liners and iron beams. The name just suits her. She's sturdy, reliable, and takes bullets all day without complaint. Industrial gray, with a tiny flag tucked between her exhaust fan and switch, Bertha reminded me of something from the off-limits corner of shop class, where instead of building birdhouses, we spent our time folding sheets of metal until they became blade-like things we loved to hold, wield, jab, content to wound nothing but air. And how did it feel to test fire thousands of guns each year? Boring, he said. You end up deaf and stuck with a bunch of water too polluted to dump. Then he loaded 2 hollow points, slipped his Glock into Bertha's PVC pipe, called out, "Ears for 2, and fired both rounds. The sound of gunshots was chased by the metallic chime of cartridges dropping to the floor, a slow slosh of water, one screw rolling in half circles across the tank's trapdoor. Call that an American song, and nothing happens, or worse. Although perhaps it is worse to admit that after he netted the metal nubs and placed them into my hand, their split tips curling back in petal-like shapes extending from a center copper speck, blossom was the word that came to mind. Even if months later I saw some earrings online made from the same kind of bullets, each one flower-shaped and described by the artist as clear-coated and tumbled to a smooth finish, that doesn't change how much I'd wished for a different word to hold in that cramped room as little waves moved, then stopped. It's possible the figurative ran its course here a while back. Do we really need a personified tank and metaphor of an oar smacking the surface of a lake where they pour Bertha's lead-tainted water each week to understand we're paddling nowhere? Once, the cop told me, they received a call about someone bleeding on a bus. They pulled the vehicle over and found a guy using a broken-off tree branch to gouge a bullet from his calf. I'm still trying to picture this, still trying to form the image of the man and the branch he held. It was November. Nothing was blooming in Cleveland once again when he told them, hell yes, he'd been shot a few blocks back. Fuck off, kindly leave him alone, and he'd just get the hell on with his day. I'll just read one more. I'll end with a final poem. This one is not so much stemming from travels, but more just responding to news of mass shootings. There's also a kind of hinge to this piece is Dylan Thomas's great poem about nostalgia and the fall from innocence, Fern Hill. That's referenced here. You need to know that Cleveland sports teams always lose. You know, it's funny. I was just thinking as I was driving here, every time I say that same joke, I get more laughs the closer I get to Boston, I realize. So it's interesting. I'm tracking it. Green means literally 1,000 things or more. So concludes an essay on Fern Hill, in which the student seems somewhere between jazzed up and pissed off that green might mean so many things from one stanza to the next. Here, a blooming Eden proxy. Here, rot made by the grip of time, for starters, or that sun-slaked field not far from our classroom, as lush green as any Welsh farmyard, grayed overnight with frost. Emerald beer bottle hurled from a car, the slack-jawed lime green goblin face spanning a front porch post-Halloween for so many weeks, it looks like it's here to stay. The long ago brown green of Cleveland, where it rained always and without pity, upon a past I craved despite myself, and our team lost always, 14-2. Every time we waited in the bleachers for the game to resume, my father would look down upon the outfield's mowed lines and proclaim, "Still a lot of green out there," meaning anything can happen and will. Have you ever heard in a crowd the saddest part of "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," where everyone lies and pretends we don't care if we ever get back, and makes the last word echo twice more? We always want to get back, whether or not we're hailing childhood green. Like the student in our essay, I too could keep rattling off images of spring and decay. June sunset horizon flash, summer hair stained olive from churning over chlorinated pools, green shadow of a hand that makes it feel, as it says in the poem, as if owls were bearing everything away. Instead of looking again at the image online, I glimpsed before returning to my still ungraded hay-high stack of student work. Maybe you saw it too. Maybe you also had the spellbound luck of wandering to other tasks instead of asking what it means to know anything can happen in a wholly different way. Instead of looking once more at the slash of police tape that is the only horizon that matters just now for the two men in the photograph who sit together on the curb, faces glowing blue-red in the lights, both of them bleary-eyed but alive, swaddled in aftermath, and a blanket that is green, a detail that couldn't matter less given how the numbers of the dead still rise. Here we are again, as inevitable as the clock's tick, looking in at a place that now will never be young again. Is there a way to say it? There's been a shooting that will allow it to be heard, remembered and heard without the easy glide of our past tense, that will stop us from wanting to turn to anything under the wide starry sky that is not the green fire burning in the minds of those men, or the green of a blanket America provides and provides without change. Thank you very much.